Alright, today we've got a hefty episode. We haven't done an X amount of questions atheists can't answer video in a long time, but thankfully on the 15th of February, an author named Zach over on Adherent Apologetics finally decided that we needed one of those lists. And I know I needed one. I used to tackle them all the time when my channel began. So let's roll the intro, get some announcements out of the way, and then get into the video. Alright, so let's get a couple of announcements out of the way first, then get into fan art, then the video. Alright, first off, if you're gonna be in Austin, Texas in June the 19th to the 21st, then maybe we can meet up at the Faithless Forum, because as it turns out, I'm actually going to be a speaker there again this year. I'm surprised they let me back after the last one. Last time I kinda slammed a hammer on the table in front of Thomas and a fan during a Q&A, all because he decided to make a penis joke at me. So if stuff like that is what you're into, then you should definitely come to Faithless Forum this year. Tickets are on sale now, and the location's gonna be in the Austin Hilton. There's also going to be a lot of speakers there like Paulogia, Rationality Rules, Shannon Q, Matt Dillahunty, Aaron Raw, Chris Shelton, Rachel Oates, and even some newcomers like Neil the 604 Atheist and X-Cult Baby. I'll periodically be reminding people about the forum in the lead up to it, but suffice to say I'm personally pretty excited. Alright, Faithless Forum stuff out of the way. Next we have a cat Suris by Atria, a Good and Evil cartoon style Suris by Karma is Life, and a work in progress of a dragon Suris by Little Rabbit. As always, thank you for your fan art submissions, and with that, let's get into the questions. There's 36 of them, so this is going to be one hell of a video. Alrighty, question number 1. Why is there something rather than nothing? To put it simply, if there wasn't something here, you wouldn't be here. But no, in all reality, why is there something rather than nothing? I don't know. But I think anybody who's honest would say they don't know. They might have beliefs on why. For me, I personally think the why there's something rather than nothing just comes down to how the universe works physically. But as for why on a greater scale, for you that answer might be God. God decided there needed to be something rather than nothing. But I personally don't agree with that answer. I'm perfectly confident saying I don't know. Alrighty, second question, is there any evidence that suggests the universe is eternal? And yes, there actually is. While the universe as we know it as a constantly changing state is something that we can't really determine whether or not it's eternal, matter itself, which comprises our universe, and energy don't seem to be able to be created or destroyed. This would imply at least some measure of longevity, and if it can never be created or destroyed, then, well, I guess eternity's really the only answer there. But tell you what, if you can find me a way to destroy matter entirely down to the most minute quark, then we'll effectively have an end to matter and energy, the thing that comprises the universe. If you can find that, then I'm comfortable saying that there had to have been a beginning as well. Until then, I don't think an infinite regress is any issue. Alright, number 3, if not, why do atheists hold on to the idea and say that you have debunked the Kalam cosmological argument? Because the Kalam cosmological argument has been debunked several times. But here's the thing with the Kalam specifically. It's not an invalid argument. The argument itself is in a valid logistical form. If we take the Kalam cosmological argument with premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause, premise 2, the universe began to exist, and then conclude that the universe has a cause, then we're fine. We can't determine if the universe is or is not eternal, so if we assume that the universe began to exist, then yeah, everything's fine there. The problem comes when you try to extend this particular argument to say that the cause must be God. At this point, you're committing the God of the gaps fallacy, taking some unexplained event and then concluding therefore God afterwards as if that actually grants explanatory power. But here's the thing, therefore God doesn't actually give explanatory power to anything. It's basically the my dad said so of arguments. There is still a reason why your dad said so, and there are still mechanisms that your dad used in order to do that thing that, well, he said he was doing. All of that also exists where God is concerned. All you're effectively doing is goalpost shifting away from those mechanisms and those whys, and instead making us talk about a subject, as opposed to an action. This is why people say the Kalam cosmological argument has been debunked. Moreover, there's another side to this coin, and that's the fact that the Kalam, if we accept everything, really only gets you to deism. And I know that there are Christians like Braxton Hunter, who've responded to me before, who will say that that's all part of the game. They want it to be a two-part conclusion, but here's the thing. If I go from atheist to deist, I'm not actually closer to your God. If I die in your religion, I still burn in hell. I'm nowhere closer to Christianity. I've literally walked down a different path. All I've done is move from my previous position. But that's enough of that. When we get into philosophical questions, I tend to ramble on about them, and that's kind of a problem of mine. I'm sorry. We'll move on to question 4. Question 4 is, if so, why do the vast majority of scientists reject this idea? Reject what idea would be my question. Are they rejecting the idea of the Kalam cosmological argument? Moreover, who the fuck cares what the vast majority of scientists say on a philosophical question? What this question is actually doing is accusing atheists of appealing to scientism. Basically the idea that science can answer all questions, even though there are certain things that science literally can't answer. This is where philosophy and ethics come in. But the question's trying to do is say, oh, you like scientists, you appeal to scientists, why do scientists not agree with you? Which, don't get me wrong, that is a valid course of action, especially when dealing with people like anti-vaxxers who say they're very pro-science. But in this case, I think the question's literally just trying to be a guide. Moving on to question 5, why is the universe so fine-tuned? Well, my answer to that would be fine-tuned for what? If you want to say it's fine-tuned for life, it can barely support that. There's only a handful of pockets in the entire universe that we can even assume support life, and only one that we know supports it. If your universe has a 0.00001% success rate, then it's not fine-tuned for that. And if you'd like to make the counter-argument that the fine-tuning of the entire universe around us allows our one area to have life, then my counter to that counter is that you, as a Christian, have a triomni God. God isn't limited to the laws of physics. He can literally make the laws of physics comport to whatever he wants. So don't weaken your God by trying to argue that he fine-tuned the universe for only a tiny pocket of life, because that was the only way physics would have allowed it. Also, one of the other answers to the fine-tuning argument generally is that there's only an appearance of fine-tuning. I used to play a lot of competitive card games. The chance of drawing any single hand out of a deck of 40 Yu-Gi-Oh cards is nightmarishly small, and yet you're still able to play out a game with the hand you get, regardless of how imperfect. It's fallacious to try to argue that any particular hand you get is particularly special. Every outcome was random. It's just that some of them happen to be more fortuitous than others, like the Earth being able to support life. Number 6 is, if your answer is the multiverse, why is there no evidence for that theory? And my answer's not the multiverse, so next question, I guess. And that's 7. Is it possible that there is no natural explanation for the origin of life? I'd say that it's possible, but you would need to then argue about supernatural causes and then go about proving them. Moreover, you would need to develop a method that can allow us to observe supernatural phenomenon, and if that method even closely resembles the scientific method and proves to work, then the phenomenon wasn't supernatural to begin with. Now it's within the parameters of science, meaning we still have a natural phenomenon. So I guess my answer would be, yes, it's technically possible that there's no natural explanation, but that line of reasoning doesn't get us anywhere. Number 8, where does consciousness come from? Well, it's an emergent property of the brain. A more interesting question would be, why did we develop the particular brand of consciousness that we have? This thing we know is sapience as opposed to sentience. But that's what we call an interesting question. Yours is boring. Next. Do you lack a belief that God exists, or would you say that God does not exist? Oh my god, I'm gonna get a lot of hate for this one. So if you want to call me an atheist, and I'm perfectly fine accepting that label, then I do lack a belief that God exists. That is the most accurate descriptor. Now, I am a positive atheist where the Christian God is concerned because I think that he's logically incoherent. But as for the concept of God, I merely lack a belief. If we're talking hard philosophical terms, this would make me an agnostic with specific arguments against specific deities. So agnostic on the proposition of God, but local atheist on certain propositions of God. And then in colloquial terms, that would just make me a lack-of-belief atheist anyway. So, next. Do you lack a belief that Zeus exists, or do you believe that Zeus does not exist? And this is where I lack a belief. Because if we accept, like we have to do with the Bible for a lot of Christians, that many of the stories about Zeus are metaphorical and not actually things that happened on Earth, then the idea of a superpowered deity being outside of time and space and living on their own plane of existence isn't exactly that far-fetched to me. The difference between Zeus and someone like God is that Zeus isn't logically incoherent, whereas Yahweh, to me, is logically incoherent, so I would say I lack a belief in Zeus, and I'm comfortable with that. 11. If you just lack a belief that Zeus exists, why are you centuries behind the rest of the world who say Zeus doesn't exist? Alrighty, so this is actually a fallacy in a question. This is an appeal to the populace, or an argumentum ad populum. It doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks about Zeus. My personal epistemology has a formed opinion on the proposition of Zeus. And I hope that you're aware that there are many people who do believe Zeus exists because they're pagans and polytheists. I would hope you know that and didn't just dismiss that as a bunch of silly people who believe in a fad or something like that, which I've actually heard before, but I'm not going to argue against that hypothetical. though I could, and it would be fun. Suffice to say, as for question 11, I literally give zero shits about what the rest of the world thinks of Zeus. Because ontologically, it doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks of Zeus, and epistemologically, it doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks of Zeus. The rest of the world neither affects my personal truth value and doesn't affect the actual ontological truth value of the statement. So, next. Number 12, do you act according to what you believe or what you just lack belief in? So the answer is both, and that's the answer for most people in the world. They act according to a combinations of what they do and don't believe. So that was boring. Next. 13. What evidence is there that atheism corresponds with reality? Well, there's plenty of evidence that certain local forms of atheism do correspond with reality, positive arguments against particular gods. But let's play a word game here. Let's do a fun thing, because I can actually make an argument that God both exists and atheism corresponds with reality. And I can do it in two ways. The first way is we have a deistic God that created the universe and then died. Thus, atheism would A, correspond with reality, and B, the Kalam would be true. Or if we play a word game and argue that reality is everything that exists in the natural world, and then argue that God is in a separate category called the supernatural world, then atheism is the only thing that can correspond with reality, because categorically, reality doesn't contain God. As for evidence, if we agree that arguments are evidence, then both of my arguments are evidence that atheism corresponds with reality. 14. Is atheism a worldview? No, it's an answer to a single question, and that is not in and of itself a worldview. Leading into 15, if not, what is your worldview? And my worldview is way too hard to actually define. It's a mixture of optimism and pessimism. Technically, it's pragmatism, but I don't hold to the pragmatic theory of truth. It's a bit of a complex question, but I guess cautiously optimistic pragmatist is probably the best way to describe me. Number 16 is what would convince you that God exists? And if we're dealing with an omniscient God, then my answer to that is he knows what would convince me. I don't personally know the things that would convince me. I know a laundry list of things that wouldn't, but you're asking how do you prove something supernatural to somebody who's only ever existed on a natural plane? You're also asking somebody who's incredibly skeptical about what evidence would convince him that a God exists, when even a God coming down and telling me that he is God would still lead to the question of, is this person lying? But number 17 is, are you willing to follow the evidence even if it leads to a different understanding of how the universe works? And the answer to that is yes. It was following the evidence that led me away from Christianity in the first place. Once I wasn't in a situation where I was constantly being reinforced about how Christian I needed to be, the evidence of the world around me didn't convince me that that God existed, and I slowly faded away from that belief system. Following the evidence, regardless of if it leads to a place I don't like, is how I got where I am now, because I truly wanted a God to exist. In fact, I still want a God to exist, because that would mean certain things like an afterlife can exist, and I don't want to die. At the end of the day, I'd like the ability to reincarnate, or to live another life, or even to live forever. Constantly being able to learn from my mistakes as opposed to being cut short right at the time that I figure things out. A God existing would mean that many of those things are now possible, but unfortunately the evidence seems to be insubstantial for that particular belief to flourish in my head. But number 18 is, if Jesus rose from the dead, would you become a Christian? And the answer is no, because if a person rises from the dead, even if they were Jesus, that's evidence for necromancy of some kind, not necessarily of a god. You've convinced me either of a biological phenomenon I do not yet understand, or you've convinced me that magic exists, and some wizard chose a specialization at level 2, and then you're gonna have to spend time convincing me why there still isn't a necromancer class in World of Warcraft. No, Death Knights don't count. Stop trying to convince me they do. 19 is, if you wouldn't become a Christian, why would you ever accept that he rose from the dead? And again, my answer is that there are other explanations for people rising from the dead than the Christian God is real. Necromancy, magic, biological phenomenon I do not yet understand, technology I do not yet understand. You're committing a black and white fallacy by arguing that it's either he rose from the dead and God is real, and therefore if you're not agreeing with this, then you're a silly person, or he didn't rise from the dead and God isn't real. There are other options in between, like giving me a fucking necromancer class in World... Okay, I'm done. 20. Why do atheists keep insisting faith is blind trust when that's not what Christians or the Bible say? Well, the Bible literally says that faith is the evidence of things not seen, which if they're not seen, then you would be blind and you're trusting in those things, so... You know, faith as described in the Bible would in fact be blind trust. You can argue that faith is confidence, but at that point you're just equivocating the two. And number 21, why do you want material evidence for an immaterial God? Well, I never said I wanted material evidence for an immaterial God. In fact, throughout this, I've pointed out the problems of the supernatural and natural dichotomy. So this question obviously isn't for me. Next. 22, is there a purpose to life? And is there an ontological purpose? I don't know. Do I have a purpose in life? Yes. 23, if there is, by what standard do you determine life has purpose? Well, like I said, I don't know if life actually has a purpose, but I know that my individual purpose is self-determined, so that would be my standard. The only purpose I can determine for myself is by myself. Any other measuring stick wouldn't suffice. I don't care what my parents wanted my purpose to be. I don't care what my teachers wanted my purpose to be. I don't care what you think my purpose should be. My purpose is self-determined. 24, if not, what is the point of listening to this video? Wait, this was a video? Number 25 is, where does morality come from? And it comes from people. Morals are shaped by people in society. But I'm also a moral anti-realist, so if you tried to ask me for a hard stance on morality, I would say that the proposition's probably wrong. I'll go ahead and provide a link to an article on morality in the description below. Anti-realism is hella fun to deal with. 26, how do you determine what is right and wrong? And realistically, you can't. Right and wrong are made-up concepts. But because they're made-up concepts, we can then juxtapose them to other things that we consider right and wrong. It's a bit of a tautology, but it's really the only way we can verify anything. So if something feels good and makes you happy, and it doesn't come at the expense of anyone else, then we can determine that something is right, as long as that thing is also not self-destructive. And then anything that is either self-destructive or harms people around you and forces an expense on them can be considered wrong. You can juxtapose human flourishing and human suffering together to determine this. This is something that the moral landscape tries to do, though I'm not the biggest fan of that. So I guess the answer to this really should be multiple choice. There are many ways in which you can determine that something is right and wrong, but that right and wrong will always end up being a matter of perspective. 27. When a lion kills a cub from another pride because that's what natural selection has raised it to do, is that morally acceptable? And my answer to that is that lions don't have the same code of morality that humans do. Is it morally acceptable for nature to do what nature does? I don't know. You would probably have to ask the lions if that's morally acceptable, but even then, you end up coming up with a bit of a language barrier. Unfortunately, where the animal kingdom is concerned, trying to argue questions of morality, when morality as a concept is something that we created as a society, it seems to me that you're actually trying to ask me to commit a category error. And 28, if evolution has put a sense of morality into us to help us survive, what makes our actions any better than any other animal's actions? That depends on what measuring stick you're using. What actually determines better in this case? Are we better than animals? Well, in certain cases we are. We have the ability to communicate and create better than most animals, but history has shown me that we don't exactly kill each other less. Again, trying to compare us to animals in this way seems to be another category error. 29, is it morally acceptable for you to kill a toddler because you can no longer financially support it? And the answer to that is no, at least not in my morality, and not by the morality that most people subscribe to. This is because that toddler has a right to its own bodily autonomy and integrity. And since you use the word toddler, I'm imagining that you're meaning a baby that has already been born, because if we're talking about abortion, then the answer is different. But I know you're going to get into that because number 30, is it morally acceptable to kill a fetus in the womb because you couldn't financially support it? And yes, it is. You can appeal to the violinist argument in this situation. There is no point in which that baby has any right to your body. Also, let me go ahead and point out that there's a trick of language being used here. You're using the phrase morally acceptable, but there are many immoral things that we consider morally acceptable. They all depend on circumstance and perspective. For instance, murder is not moral, but there are instances of murder that we consider morally acceptable, like, say, assassinations, or things that the military has had to do. So if it's a matter of making yourself suffer more, even if I were to argue that it is immoral for you to have an abortion, I would still say that it's the lesser of two evils and is therefore morally acceptable. Because, unfortunately, the other half of that evil would be completely destroying the quality of life of both you and the kid. Again, this is while that kid is attached to your body, while your bodily integrity is what's in question. Once it's born, the answer changes. And before anybody tries asking me about when I assign personhood, I can assign personhood at the first cell. And that's not going to be a convincing gotcha. 31 is it morally acceptable to kill a baby after it's been born? And my answer to that is the same as 29. Once it's been born, it has a right to its bodily autonomy and integrity. This is because it is no longer reliant on the autonomy and integrity of another individual. 32, how can you morally differentiate between a baby at the womb at 6 months and a baby born prematurely in 6 months? And easily, one is outside of the womb and experiencing life. One is inside the womb and is currently violating the autonomy and integrity of another individual. You can rephrase the violinist 1,000 ways to answer this question. Number 33, going off of the abortion and straight back into Christianity, randomly, who was Jesus? And my answer to that is, he was a guy. He was a guy who existed in Judea. There were a lot of people named Jesus. From what I can tell, an entire cult was formed around him. That cult blossomed into the religion we know today. 34, why did his disciples die saying he rose from the dead? And that's easy. Because they believed it. People die for lies all the time. Martyrdom is not a convincing apologetic. Number 35, why does the Bible keep lining up with archaeology? It doesn't. The Great Flood doesn't line up with archaeology. The Exodus from Egypt doesn't line up with archaeology. We haven't been able to find a Garden of Eden with a flaming sword in front of it, so again, not lining up with archaeology there either. We haven't found city walls from the appropriate era in Jericho. We still haven't found the original 10 Commandments anywhere, and this is ignoring all of the other sciences that the biblical narrative flies in the face of. There may be some instances where the Bible does line up with archaeology. This is true, because it was written by people of the time, but there are plenty of myths in the Bible that don't. So when you try to say that the Bible keeps lining up with archaeology, it doesn't. It keeps failing at that. And finally, the last question, 36, why do the 3 bloodiest regimes in history come from atheistic ideas? So if we're just going to try to argue death toll specifically because of government oppression, then the mere fact that we happen to have 3 regimes that were particularly bloody and atheistic doesn't actually mean anything. Also, Nazi Germany wasn't atheistic. They were actually incredibly Christian. Specifically, they were a majority Catholic and endorsed by the Catholic Pope at the time. So your question, while compelling on a very base level, I guess, already has some infactual data built in. And if we want to talk about Stalin's Russia, the reason that that was a bloody regime specifically due to atheism was because he saw the church as a threat to his political regime. It actually had nothing to do with his belief on God. It had everything to do with who was controlling the hearts and minds of the people. Similarly, if we want to talk about Mao and China, the Chinese government at the time that he took it over viewed outside religious groups as possibly seditious and possibly having the ability to influence the people to overthrow the government. As a result, state atheism was declared. So your enemy here isn't actually atheism, your enemy here is statism. The reliance and paranoia of whoever happens to be in political power trying to use the strong arm of the state to hurt the people. That's your actual enemy here. So why do 2 of the bloodiest regimes, because the other one, Nazi Germany, doesn't actually fit your category, come from atheism? The answer is you've committed category error again. They didn't come from atheistic ideas. They happened to use an atheistic idea as a justification to enable their paranoia and statism. But if you'd crack open a history book just a little bit, these answers are readily apparent. As long as you're not opening up a history book from Abeka literature. Those guys are jokes. Anyways, that was all 36 questions, and that was certainly a ride. Anyways, what did you guys think? I'll put a link to the questions in the description below, and if you guys have any different answers to the questions I answered, then let me know in the comment section. Hell, copy the entire list there and I'd like to see your answers. Over and all, I actually really enjoy these kinds of questionnaires. Sometimes there's the oddball question that actually makes me think a bit. So if you guys find any more like this, please let me know. Again, throw them into the comment section. But with all that said, that's all the time we have together for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and if not, well, you're already telling me in the comment section below, I'm sure. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell notification icon so you can see videos when they come out immediately, but if you want to see them earlier, then there's always my Patreon. That gives you access to videos as soon as they're off the production press, usually several days before they're scheduled. Anyways, as always everyone, Internet Video tagline here.